I'll read to you from the Gospel according to St. John chapter 8, verses 1b and the following. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again to the temple. And all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her." And once more Jesus bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
My dear sisters and brothers in Jesus and Mary, yesterday we examined how do we approach God, how do we look at God. Today, I want to reflect on with you on how does God look at us? How does God see you and me? Individually, personally, we who are made in the very image and the likeness of God. I'd therefore like to focus on the gaze of Jesus and how he looks at us. The gospel says nothing about Jesus' face, the color of his eyes or his hair, but it often speaks of his gaze, the way Jesus looked at people. It communicated feelings and emotions that words just cannot convey. A simple glance, an exchange of looks changed everything for a number of persons in the gospel. Yesterday, I gave what we call the Juvi mantra. We have a God who's scandalously merciful, shamelessly forgiving, and generously loving. And some might be inclined to say, my God, if you're going to make everything so easy and cheap as that, and people don't have the fear of God, then they will just take advantage and go on a rampage of sin. They need to have this fear of God. I have spoken very specifically to be prophetically challenging. God calls us to be the best version of ourselves. But that happens, as my founder, St. Alphonsus Liguri said, any change based on fear will never last, only that which is based on love. Because as the song I love from Aspects of Love by Andrew Lloyd Webber, love changes everything, hands and faces, earth and sky. Love will never ever let you be the same. And we see this in the number of characters and figures in the Bible. Let me draw your attention to some of them. There's Matthew, whom we heard about in this morning's gospel. Then there is Zacchaeus. The gospel text I read for you, the woman caught in adultery by the self-righteous men. And then, of course, Peter and the apostles who left everything and followed Jesus. Because the gaze, the look of Jesus made all the difference. These instances show Jesus' empathetic and loving nature, highlighting the significance of what that look of Jesus means. Let's take a look briefly at some of these figures. First of all, Matthew. Jesus goes to his house. his office, his tax collector, a place of shame for the people, because when the tax collector passed by, people spat on the street out of contempt for them. They didn't want to mix up with these unclean people. But Jesus, who chose the 12, what a strange mix. Some were from the lakeshore, and here, one seen as the very outcast. So the point is, no matter what your state is, no matter what your past is, none of us is outside the loving gaze of Jesus. When Jesus saw Matthew, to use the words of Saint Bede the Venerable, Jesus saw him through the eyes of mercy and chose him. Now, this phrase that I just read out for you is very dear to Pope Francis. When he was made bishop in 1991, he chose this as his motto. Now, Jesus didn't see Matthew merely as a sinner, a corrupt and uncaring official, but Jesus saw him through the eyes of mercy. Not only mercy, but also trust, because he invited Matthew to be part of his close inner circle, his handpicked apostles. And as soon as Matthew felt that gaze of Jesus in his heart, he got up and followed Jesus. Those of you who have an opportunity, please look up that wonderful painting of the Call of Matthew by the Italian painter Caravaggio. Something beautiful. It captures so much of that. This gaze overtook Matthew completely. It changed his life because the gaze of Jesus, the look of Jesus, always lifts us up. The word had spread around. So all the other tax collectors, the other outcasts, were invited to lunch. And Jesus did not walk away from that hated lot. We say, no, a person is known by the company they keep. If that was so, Jesus risked his reputation, because for him, redeeming others was more important than his reputation. No wonder it was said of him in Matthew 11:19 as well as Luke 7:34, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Jesus would go to all lengths to redeem people, no matter how deep down in the gutter they were. And this, therefore, is something that the outcasts felt, the look of Jesus. He lifted them up and gave them back their dignity. That's what the gaze, the look of Jesus does. We look at another person, a rich young man that we have in Mark chapter 10, verse 21. He comes to Jesus and Jesus tells him, he says, what more should I do to have eternal life? And Jesus says, sell all your possessions, give it everything and come. But for him, he was more attached to his possessions, not to Jesus, and walks away. But the beautiful thing is this, Jesus, in spite of him refusing, looks at him with love. Isn't that interesting? Because Jesus does not give up on us. And this gives hope to those who may have walked away from the faith in the hope they will one day return. Saint Monica knew that only too well with her son Augustine, who came back after many years and today is a marvelous doctor of the church. Then we have Peter. Peter, another of those handpicked. He said, I will never deny you, Lord. But he denies not once or twice, but 3 times. And then we are told in the text, in Luke 22:61, the Lord looked and turned to Peter, and Peter wept. Because that look, saying, Peter, I love you in spite of it all. And Jesus doesn't throw the past at him, because in John 21, he calls him and confirms him in his office as the shepherd, as the first pope. And in John 21, it says, go feed my lambs, feed my sheep. The look of Jesus continues to sustain us and to hold us up. Then there was the look of Jesus from the cross, where he looked on his mother and his beloved disciple and gave this mother of his to be our mother, the mother of the church. He looked at the good thief who up to the end was thieving because he stole paradise with his last breath. And then, of course, we have Zacchaeus. If Matthew was a tax collector, Zacchaeus was the boss of tax collectors. And he was even more hated, if that was possible. Zacchaeus was this short man who wanted to see Jesus and climbed the tree. But it was Jesus who saw Zacchaeus first. Jesus does not yell at him, "Come down, you scoundrel. Come down, you crook. Come down, you thief." No. He looks at him and says, "Come, I want to eat in your house today." You know, in many societies and cultures, even in India, whom you sit and eat with is a statement. And in doing so, that look, that invitation, with that gaze, Zacchaeus was now able to see everything with different eyes. That look of Jesus transformed him. Before, he was greedy. Now he is generous. Before, he wanted to gain more. But now he was happy to give. Because he gives, as we see, half his goods to the poor. And if I've cheated, restitution, I will give them 4 times as much. The power of the gaze, the transformation of the look, and the welcoming words. Wow! Isn't that wonderful? The gaze of Jesus is not just something magical, not because he was doing some hypnotism. When Jesus looked at someone, it was as if Jesus called that person by name. And that look would change their lives. That's what the look of Jesus does. You know, I'm sure you would have experienced this gaze in different ways already in your life. Maybe in a time of personal prayer. Maybe when you're seated before the Blessed Sacrament, through the sacraments of the Eucharist, of confession. And so, these are moments that are already there, even if you have not fully recognized them in your life. Pope Francis says this, that Jesus' gaze is a look that always lifts us up, never lets us down, never humiliates us. It is a look that causes me to grow, move forward, encourages me. And such a gaze brings about such a transformation in our life. Before I look at the next gospel text, I want to draw attention to ourselves. Because the question is, how do we see ourselves? When it comes to this, we can be faced with 2 extremes, especially with regard to our self-image and our self-worth. On one hand, some could see themselves worthless or useless. And this could happen due to a number of reasons. Maybe they grew up in a very difficult environment at home, always put down, never appreciated, compared with the others, never good enough. Sometimes it's because of events of the past which have left them with a burden of shame and of guilt and inferiority complex. I remark that some people get a fake PhD. What I mean is putting himself down, putting herself down, PhD. And they live with this, you meet a fair number of people, sadly, with this kind of a complex. At the other extreme are those who walk with their noses up in the air with an air of superiority, looking down on others with an arrogant pride. They are self-centered persons, egoists, and in its most serious form, narcissists, self-idolaters, self-worshippers. They hog the limelight. They dismiss the others. They hijack every conversation to focus on themselves. And God save us from such people. They walk in our midst. They see themselves holier than the rest and better than the best. They get a gold medal for self-righteousness. Now, in avoiding these 2 extremes, it's important to have a healthy and a realistic image of ourselves. We are sinners, but we are redeemed sinners. One redeemed by Christ and constantly being renewed, because conversion is an ongoing process, constantly being restored into God's image because of the gaze of love and of compassion. And the more we have a healthier image of God, the more we will have a healthier image of ourselves. Now, there is one event in Jesus' life that very clearly illustrates the triumph of mercy over justice. And that is the gospel text that I read for you. John tells us in the gospel that the scribes and Pharisees brought a woman caught in the act of adultery to Jesus in order to test him. These men pretending to be true to God, manipulate the law using this poor woman in order to be able to accuse Jesus. If Jesus said yes, this was a trick question. If Jesus said yes to the stoning of the woman, they would report him to the Roman government because only the Roman government could execute anybody. If Jesus granted her pardon, then he would be accused of ignoring the Jewish law, and that he would lose credibility among the Jewish people. The forces, these men who brought this woman to Jesus, were powerful because they had a big role in interpreting the scriptures, in interpreting the law. They just weren't being honest. They revealed their sin of patriarchy and male dominance in harassing this woman. If she was caught in the act of adultery, tell me, where is the man? Because she can't be committing adultery by herself. These dirty old men were simply ogling at her. And therefore, if for every such accused woman, think of the many men who had probably used and abused her. Today, there are some who pretend to uphold church teaching and yet viciously attack those who do not. It could be persons who are in painful situations, not right in the teaching of the church, but who are nonetheless human. Persons who go through the pain of separation or divorce, transgenders, homosexuals, people whose choices are not ours, particularly in the line of our faith, but they are still the children of God. Nothing can change that. The Pharisees, sadly, were experts in the love of law, but they had forgotten the law of love. Let us see how Jesus responds to this situation. Despite their religious observances, these men are far from God. They saw themselves as pillars of society. You have to trip only once and you are labeled and condemned. You are not given another chance, another opportunity. And they do not expect God to make these concessions. They make God, sadly, in their own petty image and likeness. What about the woman? We know very little about her. Not her name, her age, her social status. What about the man? Was she being raped? Was he being paid? What's the story? She was a woman who failed and admitted that she failed. She did not say, no, I did not do it, I'm innocent. She was willing to make her confession to Jesus. Saint Augustine describes this very poetically when he says, Jesus is left alone with the woman. He says, two are left, misery and mercy. The woman hears the good news from Jesus. That's interesting. This woman, who was considered to be deserving of death, remains standing up before Jesus. But hear me carefully. The gaze is different. Jesus does not look at her. His head is down. He did not want to embarrass her in this crowd of men who were staring and yelling at her. His head was down. It was only when they all went away that he stood up and he looked at her. In other words, before the gaze of his look, there was the gaze of his heart. He didn't want to, such delicacy in the face of such sin. And we see that this compassionate heart and the gentle tone of Jesus, has no one condemned you, neither do I, but then go and sin no more. Scandalously merciful, but prophetically challenging. Because in Jesus, justice and mercy meet. He was looking at a person already hurt by sin, so that to be an instrument of healing and forgiveness. The story is more than Jesus and the woman. It involves the scribes and Pharisees, because they drew a circle, as it were, and put the woman in it. Jesus drew a bigger circle and put all of them into it, because the teachers of the law and the Pharisees were not able to experience the power of of redemption. Jesus says to them, go, sin no more. She was left there for the blessing. What about the men? They had gone before the blessing. The text never really tells us what happened to them. But this text invites you and me too to the offer of redemption. What is going to be our response? If this is how Jesus looks at us, how do we look at others? There is a privilege, but there is also a responsibility. Are we stoning anybody? Is there someone struggling with a sin or a vice or a problem? Do we lay further burdens on them or her with our gossip, our rumor, our sly remarks? Or him? We would say, one can't expect anything better from him. Or she's the sort who will do it, And we, by innuendo, by insinuation, we throw stones. Are we people who find fault with others? Someone makes a mistake, we never let them forget it. Do we take a great delight in pointing out the faults of others, labeling, categorizing, pigeonholing them? And with a single stroke of the brush, or rather the tongue, we do it with an air of self-righteousness. Some are champion stone throwers. We cannot tolerate the sinner. Sin stinks, except our own, only that of others. Examine the bag of stones that you are carrying ready to throw on someone. I will show him, I will settle her, I will fix them. That's the kind of language that some people will use to rip them apart and take delight in this poisonous talk. It could be also some stones we are throwing at our own selves, ready to bang a head on the wall, because when you have found that you have fallen into sin, you are so discouraged, so afraid to start all over again. But God is at your side. He says, come with a repentant heart and experience the merciful gaze of the Lord. To correct the woman was much better than to stone her. To pardon and save her was much better than to condemn her. Because finally Jesus said, if anyone is without sin, cast the first stone. If at all there was anyone who could have cast the stone, it was Jesus, and he chose not to. Because we have in John 3:16, God loved the world so much that he gave his only son not to condemn, but to save. That is what the scandalous and merciful love of God does for us. There's a beautiful text that I love from 1 John chapter 3 verses 1 and 2. See what love the Father has given us. There's one translation that has lavished upon us. Wow. That we should be called children of God, and so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is because it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children. We are God's children now. It does not yet appear what we shall be. And when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. I come back to that saying. We have a God who is scandalously merciful, shamelessly forgiving, generously loving, and prophetically challenging. Let me illustrate it with a story. There was a family, father, mother, and the son, grown-up son. One day the father entered the son's room and found some books and discovered that these were books stolen from the library. And he said, go back and return it, son. And so he did so. 3 months later, when he came into his son's room again, he found again a case of robbery. So he said to him, son, I told you, this is not what you should be doing. Return what you have stolen. 6 months later, when he stumbled into the room, he found it yet once again. This time, this generally gentle, kind father found it too much to bear. With a slight tap of his hand, he gave him a whack. And then he went out, closing the door behind him. But once he got out of the room, he was weeping. He was weeping at what had just happened. A couple of years later, the man died, and one day this son grown further, was sitting with his mother, and his mother was talking about the memories of the father. And then she said, "Son, do you remember that you had stolen those books, right? Not once, but 3 times." He said, "I do." She said, "Just out of curiosity, did you ever steal again?" He said, "No, never, ever again." And the mother, with a shy, sly smile, said, "Oh, so the beating worked, huh?" He said, "No, no, it was not the beating. I just could not bear to hear the sound of my father weeping. I could not bear to hear the sound of my father weeping." When you love, you don't want to wound the one you love. And that's why when you love, you will never, ever take advantage of a God who's scandalously merciful, shamelessly forgiving, and generously loving. He prophetically challenges us to be the best version of ourselves. And that is what we are celebrating today as we reflect on this theme. Let me take you quickly to the 2 points that I will end my reflection every day. And first is the detail. Today, I want you to look at the look of Jesus and the look of Mary. The look of Jesus, interestingly, I've got to spend more time, but let me focus quickly, is beyond. People say he's looking at the instrument of passion and is afraid. I don't believe that, because he's looking beyond it. He's looking at the Father and knows that he's going to face, but he's going in the arms of his mother, who will stand by him to the very end. Look at the gaze of Mary. No matter where you are seated, that look of Mary, that compassionate look of Mary, looks at you wherever you are, not with the gaze of somebody wanting to catch you out, but the gaze of compassion. A mother of perpetual help. So that's the detail I would like to point. I want to point out how we can be pilgrims of hope. You know, I spoke about the various experiences that I've already had in prayer time, Blessed Sacrament, sacraments. I want to focus on the sacrament of confession, because it is a place where we will experience the loving and compassionate gaze. When was the last time did you make your confession? When was the last time were you reconciled in that beautiful sacrament with God? Do not delay. Be reconciled with God. Be reconciled with others. And yes, be reconciled with yourself. Because you must allow the burden of shame and guilt, the worthless and brokenness, to be lifted up and to be healed. Come, experience the compassionate gaze, and even more, the forgiving love and mercy of Jesus, especially in confession. Because then we will become pilgrims of hope. We will become pilgrims with hope. So let me conclude. The Lord looks on you with love. His gaze is compassionate mercy. Lap it up. Jesus says, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you." Wow. Let yourself be flooded, inundated with that love. And don't feel guilty about wanting more, because such is the love of God. May we all experience it together.